North Korea is warned of more offensive action in light of the recent security talks between South Korea and the U.S. that took place here in the country last week during U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's latest Asia visit. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to this week's first edition of Press Perspective. It's Monday, November 10th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. North Korea continues to denounce defense talks between South Korea and the U.S., even as the regime itself commits to drive forward its military partnership with Russia. For more on this, I have Shreyas ready with news website NK News here in the studio. Shreyas, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Dr. Bong Youngshik at the Yonsei Institute of North Korean Studies. Dr. Bong, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleased to be here.
Right, Shreyas, we'll start here in the studio. Let's begin with some background information regarding North Korea's latest threat of, quote, offensive action in response to recent security talks between South Korea and the U.S.
Yeah, so over the weekend, North Korean Defense Minister No Kwang-chol essentially issued this threat of offensive action, as you mentioned, in response to what North Korea describes as the Trump administration's brazen moves in conjunction with South Korea. Essentially, they said, we have understood the U.S. hostile intent, and so we will take action in response to it. This is quite standard for North Korean threats, where, as far as they're concerned, any activities involving the U.S. and South Korea are hostile actions aimed solely at Pyongyang, and then essentially they always warn of a countermeasure or firm response. And so in this case, it was sparked by a combination of two things. One was the visit of the U.S. nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS George Washington, which arrived in Busan last week, as well as U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's visit to South Korea, where he visited the DMZ and also held annual security talks with his South Korean counterpart, Ang Gyu-baek. So in the annual security consultative meeting, the two ministers essentially decided, they pledged to continue joint efforts toward deterring North Korea, highlighting the continued threats, the continued build-up, and said they're going to be on the same page. And I think for North Korea, if they were perhaps hoping for a shift in the Trump administration in terms of dealing with North Korea, they certainly didn't get that. So now what they're seeing is Pete Hegseth pledging cooperation with South Korea. That to them is very much, as North Korea often says, practically a declaration of war, or places them on that footing. And so North Korea did what it always does, threatened to counter U.S.-South Korea military cooperation.
Right, and Dr. Bong, ahead of this threat by Pyongyang, British online newspaper The Independent cited South Korean intelligence officials warning of a possible North Korean nuclear test should its leader give the order. What do you believe are the prospects of a nuclear test by North Korea in the near future, Dr. Bong, keeping in mind the current state of geopolitics?
If North Korea is going to conduct another nuclear test, there will be the 7th nuclear test conducted by North Korea. And it is a political decision. There is no technological hurdle for North Korean authority to go ahead and conduct another nuclear test than the Punggye nuclear test site. By the way, those nuclear test tunnels at the Punggye site were supposed to be irrevocably and irreparably destroyed by North Korea's own voluntary action in 2018, and somehow they have been miraculously recovered enough to be able to conduct nuclear tests. So when it comes to North Korea's promises for denuclearization, you have to take them with a grain of salt and make sure that you verify the result. By the way, the potential 7th nuclear test by North Korea will not make much sense because what North Korea needs is a reliable delivery system to carry nuclear bombs to anywhere inside the United States in order to prove that North Korea indeed possesses sufficient nuclear second strike capability against the United States. North Korea does not have to build more or more sophisticated nuclear bombs. What North Korea is a delivery system that will penetrate the missile defense system of the United States and that of South Korea. So if North Korean authority determines to conduct another nuclear test, it may, but what's the strategic benefits for North Korean military? Just raising tension in order to get more attention from the Donald Trump administration of the United States. President Donald Trump already made it clear that he's willing to talk with the supreme leadership of North Korea. It was North Korean leadership balked at having another meeting with the U.S. president on the Korean peninsula. So I don't see much benefits or justification for North Korean authority to conduct another nuclear test. It will be total waste of time, resources, and the test.
Right. And before we touch upon prospects of a meeting between Mr. Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, Shreyas, as I mentioned earlier, North Korea has taken issue with South Korea's security talks with the U.S., but the regime itself appears to be forging ahead with its military partnership with Russia. In fact, there were talks held in Pyongyang last week. Could you tell us a bit more about that encounter?
Yes, so there was a visiting Russian military delegation led by Vice Defense Minister Viktor Goremuikin, pardon my pronunciation. And so we don't actually have a lot of concrete details about what they did during their brief visit to North Korea, but we do know that the delegation held talks with North Korean Defense Minister No Kwang-chol. Essentially, North Korean state media just put out a basic two-line report saying that they met and didn't really tell us much about what was discussed. And separately, the same delegation also met with officials from the Korean People's Army's General Political Bureau. And it was essentially about boosting cooperation, exchange, and coordination between the two countries' militaries and defense ministries, which is very much something that is a recurring trend with North Korea. So even though we saw no real specific agreements during this meeting, at least none that we know of, it was very much about sending a message of continued military cooperation between Pyongyang and Moscow. And that was the message that kind of kept coming through in these brief reports, that this is aimed at continuing the cooperation that Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin have already furthered in line with the two countries' comprehensive strategic partnership agreed upon last year, which is essentially a military alliance by any other name. And so we've seen that play out on the battlefields of Ukraine with troop deployments and weapon supplies, but it's quite possible that the two countries will look to take this even further, and so they will continue having regular talks and meetings like this going forward.
And staying with this alliance, Dr. Bong, how concerned should the international community be about the continued military partnership between Pyongyang and Moscow?
Well, the rest of the countries in the international community would definitely prefer to see acceptable and peaceful ending of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia that has started in February 2022. Now it's over 3 years, and no one would like to see more casualties and destruction. So North Korea's involvement in the Russia's military conflict with Ukraine is a concern for the entire international community, and military assistance and partnership between the countries is a source of great concern. But at the same time, Russia has not really crossed the red line set by the United States, Japan, and South Korea, especially by South Korea, which is Russia providing essential technological assistance to North Korea development of more sophisticated military satellites, nuclear missiles, and other advanced weapon systems. So North Korea's military involvement in Russia has been focused on supply of the armories, especially artillery shells, and the deployment of the 11th battalion. but the casualties on the part of North Korean troops deployed to Russia have been so significant. North Korean military was actually deployed to actual battlefield situation during the period from December 14th last year and January 14th this year. And out of 12,000 North Korean soldiers, 2/3 have been either killed, about 2,000 of them got killed, according to the estimate by the National Intelligence Service of South Korea, and additional 6,000 were severely injured. So if 2/3 of your troops are either killed or seriously injured, not to be deployed back to the battlefield, then that means your troop is essentially completely demolished. So the lessons drawn by North Korean military from this battle-tested experience in the military conflict between Ukraine and Russia is that the country is miserably failed in military modernization, and North Korean troops are not battle ready in any modern warfare conditions because they are totally defenseless against drones. So it's going to make great deal of a psychological ripple effect among North Korean soldiers and their families because they're going to see 2/3 of their fellow soldiers are returned to homeland either cold dead bodies or severely injured. Then they will realize that despite all this grand propaganda issued by the government, they are powerless. They are not really up to the task and challenges to deal with South Korean military and U.S. forces in South Korea. And it's going to make a critical blow to, public loyalty to the regime after this tragic loss of young lives among the North Korean troops deployed to Russia. So I think there will be a limited effect on the part of Russia-North Korea military partnership because the war is in a stalemate, and the North Korean authority knows very well that the utility and leverage of North Korea upon Putin government of Russia will be diminishing if the prospect for ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia will be materialized in near future. So time does not favor North Korean authority because the utility of North Korea to Russia is going down. And this is a critical variable for the future military partnership between Russia and North Korea.
Right then, against that backdrop, Shreyas, the South Korean Unification Ministry has undergone some structural changes aimed at reportedly advancing efforts to ease tensions here on the Korean peninsula. Could you tell us a bit about these changes and also about the concerns raised by some pundits, that is, with regard to the lack of monitoring North Korea's human rights abuses?
Well, I think the Unification Ministry, perhaps like many other ministries, but in some ways even more so, tends to be very politicized. So every time there's a change of administration in South Korea, the priorities often tend to change. So where the last government deprioritized and essentially defunded exchange initiatives related to exchanges and cooperation with North Korea and tried to place a greater emphasis on spotlighting North Korea's abject human rights record, in the case of the Lee Jae-myung administration, it's been about trying to reverse track and go back to an era where there's more cooperation or at least engagement with North Korea. And so Lee Jae-myung has emphasized his END initiative for dealing with North Korea, which revolves around exchange, normalization, and denuclearization. And so that exchanges part has figured prominently in the Unification Ministry's budget proposal for this year, essentially restoring it to, and in some ways going beyond previous levels, to try and promote more cooperation with North Korea. The question is, of course, will North Korea respond? But that's another matter. But as a result, there have, of course, been concerns about how much South Korea is putting the focus on the human rights aspect, that the Yoon administration was keen to emphasize. Now, the biggest share of the Unification Ministry's budget is still for humanitarian initiatives, but more focused on specific themes like climate change or environmental issues. And so what we've instead seen is there was about $2 million earlier that was allocated for spotlighting North Korea's human rights issues, and that has now been eliminated from the most recent budget. And as a result, quite a few observers, particularly those in the human rights space, have said this is a matter of concern. While many have welcomed the focus on engaging North Korea, some believe that South Korea should not be taking its attention away from also critiquing North Korea's problems and downplaying those concerns. Fundamentally, we're right now in a situation where the US has also, perhaps to some extent, deprioritized human rights issues, and with South Korea also doing so, there are questions. Who's going to stand up and be the leader on the world stage when it comes to addressing North Korea's human rights issues? And so that is where perhaps it feels like there's a bit of a void now. And so certainly some pundits and some in the human rights community believe South Korea should be the one stepping in to fill that void.
Right. And Dr. Bong, speaking as a scholar, what do you believe are the pros and cons, if you will, of the current South Korean administration's North Korea policy? And before you answer that question, Dr. Bong, how would you characterize the current administration's North Korea policy?
I would characterize the current administration North Korea policy based upon many contradictions with a good intention. So it does not have any strong prospect for success because North Korean leadership would not have any strong incentive to listen to North Korea policy of the Lee Jae-myung government as such. The pros of the current government's North Korea policy are its attempts to reduce the dangerously escalated military tension between the two Koreas during the previous Yoon government, like sending drones to Pyongyang and up the ante of the use of force in case of North Korea provocation. So the attempts by the Lee Jae-myung government to cool the temperature on the Korean peninsula so that the situation will be so facilitated for the North Korean authority to come out and talk to the United States and South Korea for possible peace deals, including denuclearization, would be one of the major pros. The cons are there's no consistency or the well-planned roadmap in the North Korea policy of the Lee Jae-myung government. As Mr. Reddy said, that Lee Jae-myung government North Korea policy is premised upon three principles: that South Korea respects the North Korean system, and South Korea has no intention to have hostile actions against North Korea, and South Korea will not pursue unification by absorption. And as an extension of these three principles, President Lee Jae-myung announced END policy in his speech delivered in this year's United Nations General Assembly meeting in New York in September. END. E means exchange, and after exchange, South Korean government will pursue normalization, and normalization will lead to denuclearization on the Korean peninsula. But exchange is not a non-starter. It's a non-starter because for any inter-Korean exchange to take place, there should be sanction reliefs on North Korea, and those are not in the authority of South Korean government. North Korea knows very well that any economic sanctions on North Korea will be dependent upon the decisions of the Trump administration of the United States. So North Korean authority has no reason to talk to Lee Jae-myung government of South Korea, which has no realistic power to make any substantial change on the front of economic sanctions on North Korea. North Korea is better off to wait for the beginning of the communication and dialogue with Washington, not with Seoul. And the concept of normalization is also problematic. The normalization assumes that the current situation on the Korean peninsula is not normal. It should be normalized. Then what should be normalized? Are you talking about the current situation, the division of the Korean peninsula with the two Koreas? Then the answer to correct the abnormal situation on the Korean peninsula is one of the two. Either separation of the two Koreas permanently as two separate sovereign states without pursuing unification as avowed by Mr. Kim Jong-un himself in December 2023, or peaceful unification, which is stipulated in the Article 3 and 4 of South Korean Constitution. So in order for Lee Jae-myung government's E&D policy to be materialized, South Korea needs to revise its constitution and abrogate Article 3 and Article 4 in order to deal with North Korea as a separate sovereign state, to normalize currently abnormal state on the Korean peninsula. And there's no guarantee if the situation will be changed in terms of Lee Jae-myung government's definition of normal state on the Korean peninsula. There is no guarantee that new state on the Korean peninsula will definitely lead to denuclearization of North Korea, because North Korea wants to be recognized by the United States and other countries as a de facto nuclear power state. So any talks in the future regarding North Korea's nuclear weapons will not be denuclearization according to North Korean government's position. It should be nuclear arms control talks. So these three elements, E and D, sound great, but does not really make sense in terms of possibly generating meaningful change of behavior on the part of North Korea. And there's a great deal of problems regarding revision of Constitution of South Korea.
Right. Hence your view that the policy includes contradictions but with good intentions. Perhaps expanding on the thoughts of Dr. Bong Shreyas, there was a pundit who shared his thoughts on the online news magazine The Diplomat, where he spoke about how the South Korean administration's North Korea policy is built on outdated assumptions. Could you very briefly go over that for us?
Yes, so in this case, the pundit highlighted three underlying assumptions that he said were flawed, which is that the policy assumes that North Korea is isolated, two, it still desires unification, and three, that it is willing to give up its nuclear weapons. And as Dr. Bong just pointed out, fundamentally, all of those are incorrect. North Korea is no longer in the place it was at the end of the Cold War, when these principles were kind of formulated. It has strong international partners, particularly Russia and China, so it no longer feels the need to rely solely on the US and South Korea. In terms of unification, Kim Jong-un very openly walked away from that 2 years ago and hasn't shown any signs of moving towards that again. And denuclearization, well, that's a non-starter because North Korea enshrined its nuclear status in its laws 3 years ago, and since then has consistently maintained it will refuse to talk to anyone else as long as they insist that North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons. As far as it's concerned, those are its fundamental right, and it will never yield on those demands.
Right. It has claimed that talks with the U.S. will only take place if the Trump administration removes the word denuclearization from the table. All right, Shreyas, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Dr. Bong, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.